So, good afternoon again, and thank you for staying. Because if you all go home after coffee break, who should I talk to, right? I can't go on talking to Eugenio because, as he always says, he's the one who taught me everything I know. So, I can't just talk to Eugenio. But now, I'm very glad I'm gonna talk about bilingual education and assessment from another point of view, because many of the things that Bruna mentioned about how to use assessment as a tool for management and for making the language department in your school grow is something that I should be talking today. In fact, I should be in São Carlos, which is in the country area of São Paulo, applying Toefl today at Educativa. So they've been applying the exam today. But I'm going to talk about something that you will probably think that I'm not going to talk about assessment, but yeah, promise that I am. If I turn this on. Okay, so when we think of assessment, we all who work in schools, who work with language teaching or teaching something through language, we all have different concepts of what assessment really is. And then this is absolutely crazy, and it's not gonna work the way I wanted. But anyway, let's think about the things we write in the tests and why we have so many problems with the things that we teachers write. So if I ask a child to write, olha a sua volta e desenha nos espaços exemplos de seres vivos e não vivos, this is absolutely right. This is absolutely right. And what is the problem? If I ask a child, this is probably a 7-year-old because this is BNCC for year 1. So probably this little kid is 6, maybe 7 years old. And then when she draws, this is a living thing and she's right. And this is a non-living thing and she's also right. And when I ask her, look around and then draw, what is missing in the instructions here? Draw something that you can see in the classroom that represents a living thing. Maybe you also have a plant, not only kids and teacher, and non-living things. So one of the problems that we usually have from the very beginning is the kind of instruction that we give to the kids when we are thinking of testing internally, our daily process of writing assessments and tests. Another example of this is like, localize o Brasil no mapa e escreva o seu nome e depois os 2 oceanos, and this is the guy's name. Right? But this is not a joke because look, he wrote Pacífico, tem até acento, and he wrote Atlântico. So he's not really making a joke. He's serious about the answer that he gave. So paying attention to the kind of instruction, escreva seu nome, he's absolutely right. And that's what the teacher did, considered it correct, because it is correct. But the instructions are not clear. And this one would be my answer. Encontre o X, ele está aqui. And this is, of course, this is a joke. But this is not the correct verb here. The verb is calculate. It's not find. If you ask someone to find the X, the person found it. It's not, I don't want him to find, I want him to answer, calculate. So this is something that I'd like to start with, how careful we must be when we ask for something in a test. And then slow down, my love. And then, yeah, there's one more. The only one that I wrote in English. Where is Bruna? We had a problem. It's going backwards. It shouldn't go. It should go forward. But I have an instruction here that says, I hate when people do that for me because I like to do it on my own, but it has to work. If it doesn't, Eugenio, then I thank you very much and I'll be just telling you to move. Okay, could you? It really doesn't work today, but we do, right? So we work together. So moving on and on. Eugenio, back. More. More. Yeah, this one. Okay, so look. This is the last one. But if you have, what do you do with your friends and family? And the kid remembered the song and just got into Madagascar, right? The song from the movie. But look, pay attention to the instructions here. Complete the sentences below with action verbs. Action verbs like jump, dive, float, and swim. So if the kid just wrote 1, 2, 3, 4, copying the 4 verbs that you give here, it's absolutely correct, even if the child doesn't have any idea of what the verbs really mean. So what we mean is, there's no use in testing if you don't know what you are testing. There's no use in asking kids to answer exercises if the instructions are not clear and if you don't have very clear objectives of what you are going to test. So, assessment in bilingual education, to talk about assessment, we need to understand 2 things. One that has been the topic of today, which is assessment, what assessment really means, and the other one is what bilingual education really means. And even though I'm talking about bilingual education now, one of the things that I like to talk about is helping kids become bilingual. Doesn't matter if it is through bilingual education, through extended class load, or how you are going to help them grow bilingual. But this is the focus, helping the kids become bilingual. And then if I ask you, what do we mean by bilinguals? And we think about bilingual schools where the kids sometimes start when they are 4 months old, when they are 1 year old, and they already start having contact with more than one language. If we go into the concept of what a bilingual person is, a bilingual person, and this is theory, is not the sum of 2 monolinguals. So the bilingual kid is going to mix up the 2 languages, say some things in English e outras em português, and that's fine, because this is the way that they grow up. Their world is bilingual, and they have no idea of what distinct languages are. The brain doesn't separate languages. It's all together. And then when you ask them a question, I've seen in lessons, for example, observing lessons in Portuguese, the teacher would say to the students, que outra palavra vocês lembram com a letra M? And there was this little one saying, apple, 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 and see the relationship that he did. And in his mind, apple começa com a letra M, and this is right. There's no problem there. This is not a confusion. This is not a mistake. But if we are not aware of what we are doing when we are talking to bilingual kids or emergent bilingual kids, then we don't know what to evaluate. We don't know how to consider their full repertoire. And this is what we should consider when we are planning evaluation or assessment. A balanced bilingual does not exist. None of us here. We don't know exactly the same things in English and in Portuguese. We know a few things only in English. We know other things only in Portuguese. And nobody knows exactly the same amount of English and Portuguese, or to any other languages. So when we say that, as you grow in the direction of proficiency, you sound like a native speaker, or you get closer to the discourse and to the repertoire of a native speaker. That doesn't mean that our two languages are at the same level. And this is very important because many times when we are talking in English, we feel like saying something in Portuguese, and it also happens the other way around, right? Another concept is that individuals select and use features from a unitary linguistic repertoire in order to communicate. So this is automatically solved by the brain. We don't think in English or in Portuguese, we just think. And we just communicate what we have to communicate, and sometimes we go from one language to the other just because we need to. And this is translanguaging. Translanguaging doesn't mean that you can speak Portuguese in class. Translanguaging means that sometimes Portuguese is the only way to say one very special thing, right? That can go from saudade to imbrochável, you know, but there's no way for you to translate a few things, right? They exist in one language. They are not something that you can easily find a word and translate, right? So this is the idea of translanguaging. You go naturally in one language, and sometimes you use something else in the other language. When we travel like to Los Angeles, California, in the area like Texas, the border, and we meet so many people who live in that area who have Mexican origin. There are words like abuelita, they only use in Spanish. They don't translate because they are more meaningful for them in their native language. So this is what the concept of translanguaging is all about. But the important thing is language doesn't mean the same when we are bilingual. So when you say, I love you, it's different from saying, eu te amo. When you say, I'm sorry, it's different from saying, me perdoa. And this is so deep into the building of human beings that we can't explain why. They are so different, and they mean different things, right? And things that are very hard to assess. Another concept is all speakers have a singular linguistic repertoire. So even though the tests and the assessments, even though they test what we should know in order to be considered a B1, a B2, a C1, our repertoire is unique. Nobody knows the same things, even if we study together from hello, what's your name, up to proficiency. We don't know the same things. There are words that only you use. There are things that only you like to talk about. So our repertoire is unique no matter how, when, for how long we learned a language. So taking these concepts, we go into who are and why emergent bilinguals are not language learners. And this is a very important concept in the way that we've been thinking of the learners or the emergent bilinguals in Brazil and in the world. And this implies in how we should be assessing what they know. So a language learner is not an emergent bilingual. The concept is different. And when we think of, Eugenio, please. When we think of language learners, we have a different definition from when we think of an emergent bilingual. When we talk about a language learner, our focus is on the language, only the language. I want to know if they know the language. And when we talk about emergent bilingual, the focus is not only on the language, but also on content. This person is able to use language to talk about things that are not necessarily social, not only social language. And that's why Jane today, when she was talking about the subject areas that are part of the Toefl exams, she mentioned science, math, and social studies, and language and literature. So this is what a course focusing on the language doesn't help us talk about, because you may know English fluently, but maybe you don't know how to explain photosynthesis or the water cycle in English because you never studied it. And then the words are missing. You don't know the vocabulary, even when you know the process. If there are some of you who have been working with bilingual education, you know how much you have to study to teach something. You know that you graduated in languages because you hated math, and now you study math because you want to teach language through math. Right? So we've been studying science and history and geography and math and physical education and so many things that life was so much easier when our problem was present perfect. Right? It was much easier when we had to focus on the teaching of present perfect. Now we focus on so many things at the same time that things have become much more challenging and much more difficult. So we are not testing language, we are testing language and the ability of understanding language through content or talking about content when you use the language. And this is much more complex and much more interesting for us if we consider the result through the process of learning. And then, if we don't have language learners, if we don't have language learners, we don't have foreign language anymore. Foreign language belongs to someone who's not you. Foreign means do outro. Right? And it's never yours. And when we talk about an additional language, it means that it transforms who you are. It allows you to be in different places where you wouldn't be if you were monolingual. It allows you to understand things that you wouldn't understand as a monolingual. It allows you to understand culture, to understand people, to understand diversity, and to get access to content that you might not have if you were a monolingual. So it transforms your life and the language is yours. And even though we have the responsibility of improving it and being more proficient and being more fluent and then better able to teach, even though we are never perfect in the language, not even in our first language, an additional language is yours the way it is. Perfect, imperfect, with the qualities and the problems that it has. It's yours. It doesn't belong to anyone else. So that's why the idea of my British English, my American English, my Australian English, my Canadian English is not important anymore. And this is important when we understand assessment. Because sometimes people tell us, but those exams are American. No, they are not American. They are English language testing. And it doesn't matter where you learn. You just have to be coherent. And then it doesn't sound well if I have my spelling, my American spelling and my British grammar. Then it sounds weird. But of course, if you have your style from beginning to end and you are coherent in exams where you have, for example, to write something, that's absolutely acceptable. And this is what we have to tell our students. This is what families must know. Because the stupid question is, does the school teach American English or British English? It still exists in people's mind. And this is not important anymore, because the important thing is, as a Brazilian, my English is fluent and correct enough so that other people can understand me. As a Brazilian, I can sound adequate when I talk to someone in a very formal situation or in a more informal situation. And I can adequate what I know and the language that I know, and I have strategies to ask for help when I need to say something that I don't know, because that also happens in Portuguese, doesn't it? So many times we need to say something in Portuguese and then you miss the word and you have to ask for help. So having the strategies is important, and being fluent in the language, of course, is important, especially for us who have the language as our object of work. So of course we have to be fluent and relatively correct as possible. But we also have to understand that we are never going to know everything in a language. You heard Jane today telling us that even though she's been writing items for so many years, the items that she writes go through revision and revision and revision so that no mistake is left in the items. So this is the important thing. Sometimes we write things, they sound correct, there is something that is not very correct, and we don't see those things. Like the examples that I gave in the beginning of our talk today, they sounded perfect for the teachers who wrote those questions. Those are not items, they are questions, but anyway, or exercises in a test. But anyway, they sounded perfect for the person who wrote, or they wouldn't have been part of a test, right? And then, if we think of assessment, then we are not talking about result. We are not talking about the end of the process. We are talking about a process. And this is important. The important thing is not the diplominha that we give to a student. It's not the paper. Of course, people love papers, especially us here in Brazil. We love having certificates, we love having diplomas, but this is not the point. The point is that we can get to the students one by one and show them, remember your result last year? See how much you have grown? And even if this growth is like this big, we should celebrate. Because this is the important thing, is showing them that there is process, there is progress, and they are part of this process, and they've been growing, they've been learning. So it's very interesting when we see the results, as Bruna mentioned, from her personal experience, that there is always something to celebrate. There is always, and I'm not talking about the school as a whole, I'm talking about individual results. So if you show a student that his grade has not increased in listening comprehension, but has increased 1%, 2%, 5% in any other area that has been tested, you are telling the student where he is, what he needs to improve, and what the next step is, so the student has a plan. It's not only for the school, it's for individual results. So I've been working with a couple of schools who have been applying this kind of assessment for years. And then when we compare the results, as Bruna mentioned about Barão, it's very interesting to see the progress, but it's also very interesting to see problems that you didn't expect. So, talking about Colégio Gutenberg in Mogi das Cruzes, I guess it was 2019, a little before pandemics, we observed that one of the groups of year 7 got a very low result in listening. And it was a surprise because the year before it was like the same group, and their year 6 result was much better than their year 7 result. And then we called a meeting with the teacher to understand why that group had so many problems. And the idea of having a meeting with the teacher was not to fire the teacher. This is important. It was to understand the situation and to see what we could do in order to solve the problem. And then what she said was, yeah, I don't work with listening with this group. And he said, but why don't you work listening with this group and you work with all the other 2, year 7? And then she said, because I teach them the 3rd lesson every day, and it's the coffee break from the little ones. And they are all shouting and running around near my window, and of course I don't do it. And then what did we do? We changed the schedule in a way to avoid having English lessons at that time in that room. Either she goes to another room or she teaches in another moment. But you find the problem and you can make the intervention immediately. You are not going to discover 3 years later that there was something wrong in year 7. You discover immediately. So this is one of the very important things of thinking of assessment. And then assessment then is the process of getting information. And what kind of information? Quantitative and qualitative data. Data of what a student can do and how much the student possesses in terms of repertoire. And when I talk about bilingual education, this repertoire is not only linguistic, it's much more than linguistic, but it's important to start observing how the process of assessment goes into gathering data, into analyzing and interpreting data. It makes no sense applying, having a moment to hand out certificates, calling the families and letting them go with the paper, the result. This is not what we do. This is not using properly all the data that we have. We gather and then we analyze. And when we analyze, we find all our positive and our negative problems to the group. Individually, we are evaluating the school. In many schools, the teachers don't have equipment for listening comprehension, or they have 40 students in the class to work with reading. And, so this is real life. We are not in Finland. We are in Brazil. We know. I've been to schools like almost daily to different places, and I am a teacher, and then I know the difficulties that we all face, and I know the pressure for results, and the pressure has been growing. So gathering and analyzing, interpreting and acting is what we need to know in order to get better results. Then when we think of assessment in bilingual education, we are not talking about a moment. And I always think that Toefl has something to do with Halloween, because all the schools want to apply in October. And then I don't know how they organize, right? But there must be this Halloween phenomena about Toefl, because all the schools want to apply in October, right? And what I mean is, applying an assessment must be regular. It doesn't matter whether it's in October. I am an October person. I always, Carla knows, all my schools apply in October, November. Yeah, all the schools that I advise and that use Toefl apply in October, November. But because it has to be regular. If I apply this year in October, next year in April, maybe I don't have enough time to have results that I can measure, that I can evaluate with the same criteria. So that's why it has to be regular, but doesn't matter when, as long as it's regular. As you choose a moment, and every year you try to do at the same, follow the same time. So this is something very important about when to evaluate, about how to evaluate, what to evaluate, and the students go, teacher, o que vai cair na prova? E não vai cair. You don't know what vai cair na prova. There's no answer for that, right? So what we tell them, and it's very important, is to tell them, first, you're not going to finish, and that's okay. Because they get desperate when they know they are very little. They are only 8 years old sometimes. They get desperate. They cry if they think that time is over and they haven't finished. Because the school testing system requires an end. And they don't know the difference. So it's very important that we tell them it's okay not to finish. You know when you're going to finish? When you get to colegial. Lá no ensino médio você termina. Por enquanto não é para terminar mesmo. We have to let them know that it's okay. That they should go, focus, and do as much as they can. And when you say time is over, it's okay to stop. It's okay not to finish. Eles não vão perder nota. This is the problem. This is what they are afraid of. They also need to know that silence is silence, that there is no entendi, volta, toca de novo. Because there are schools that practice for the test. And they really practice all the kinds of exercises for the test. In the schools that I work with, we don't practice anything because we want the real result, even if it's lower. But we want to know what they effectively know. We don't want them to have a test because they were trained for the test. So we just apply. We don't, we just try to make them feel comfortable. This is for us the most important thing, the social emotional skills. They have to feel comfortable, they have to understand the importance of the test, they have to understand how the test works, but we just tell them, there is something you're going to listen and a few questions to answer. Is it okay? As we do in class, this is part of our teaching process. So it must not be a surprise for them. The kinds of exercises that are in the test, we do them through the year. So why practicing? We don't want diplomas. We are not fighting for the number of students who have been approved. We want them to have the experience and to give us reliable data from what they really know and what they can talk about. So this is a little bit of what we've been doing in the schools. But assessment doesn't start at 8 years old. When they start answering tests and writing, we start assessment in early childhood. When they are, since the moment they start at school, we are already assessing, even if they are babies. And sometimes when you enter the class and you say, hello, and they are only 5, 6 months old, if they look at you, that's an answer. And that's an important answer. And this is what we should be looking at. We should be looking at the way they crawl, the way they try to get a toy, the way they move, when they cry, when they ask for help. This is assessment. And this is the daily process of assessment. And this is something that no test in the world is going to measure. But assessment and learning how to observe starts here. And the importance of observing here will help you a lot when you have your 8-year-olds applying for Toefl or for any kind of exam, and you observe and you know that the child is insecure. And you have to observe. And you have to pass by and say, responde o que você sabe, tá tudo bem. And that's the time when responde o que você sabe que tá tudo bem is important, and it can be in Portuguese. You're just calming down. You're not interfering. You're just telling the kid, it's all right. I've been through this, it's all right. So this is the observation that we learn how to do when we teach little kids. Because the little kids, when you go into, I think you can colocar todas as bolinhas, right? Yeah, because I like to do it, but anyway. No way, right? So when you are observing early childhood, you are analyzing how they socialize. If they bite, if they take things aggressively, you are observing how they eat. If they eat alone, if they need help, if they prefer something to something else. You are observing their sleeping habits. They sleep at school, and it's okay. They need to. How do they sleep? Do they need help? Do they need you to be by their side? Do they just lay down and sleep? So all those things we observe. How they develop their fine motor skills and their gross motor skills. Like when you say, open your arms, we are going to do some exercise, and then they open and hit someone else because they have no idea of distance, and then you have to teach them that there is some distance that you need. So all those things are assessment in early childhood. Cognitive development, when you tell the kid, for example, when you give them a toy or a crossword, not a crossword puzzle, what's the name of that memory game, and they have to turn and turn it back and remember where the other one is, and remember you start with only 2 pairs, right? So you have like elephant, elephant, lion, lion only. You don't have 10 animals for the babies. You have 2, and then you have 3, and then you have 4 as they grow. So this is observing how their cognitive development has been happening. And then you observe their linguistic development. And then when you say, would you like some water? And they go like this, and this is an answer. And then when you go, do you want some water? And they go, yes. And say, yes, you want some water. And then later they are going to say, yes, I do, or yes, please. But this is a process. And sometimes they can't say quero in Portuguese, and we expect them to be able to do that in English. And the mothers expect much more. Right? Much more than we teachers do. So let them know that the kids are just babies and they are not ready for much more. So this is assessment for early childhood. And then they grow a little bit. And then they go into the world of reading and writing. And when they go into the world of reading and writing, they are ready or getting ready for written assessment. And that's why we believe we shouldn't start earlier. Let them get acquainted with the reading and writing process. And when they are able to read, able to minimally write the things that belong to their everyday world, then we start assessing with this kind of external assessment as Toefl can be. Because this is something that is not developed by you. When I evaluate my students, you know that we try to be as fair as possible, but we know we feel sorry for a few things. We look at the students in different ways, depending on what they need and how much they need of our attention. And having a standardized test, which is very common in the schools, not only for English, but we have Geeky, Avalia, Evolucional, and many companies providing external evaluation to guarantee that the learning has been happening in all the areas of content. So testing in English shouldn't be a problem if we've been doing the work properly with the students. What do I mean by properly? Adequate materials, adequate methodology, very good rapport with the students, and very clear objectives of teaching and learning. So when we think then into the world of reading and writing, it is very necessary that we understand all the process of literacy acquirement. And then they are going to start from phonics. They are going to start by recognizing initial sounds and final sounds. And they can't still write a word. Sometimes they don't know the difference between a symbol like a triangle and a letter. And this is part of getting into the process of reading and writing. We have to make sure that they understand that the words have stress, that we can count syllables, right? That we can divide the words into smaller chunks. And then they have to, there are many cognitive factors involved in reading and writing. For example, the hand has to be ready to write. There is a very interesting book in Portuguese called, translated to Portuguese, Os Neurônios da Leitura. So if you read this book, the author, I'm going to remember his name and then I'll let you know, but he goes into the process of readiness for writing and for reading. So this is something, especially to write, there is a movement that the kids have to develop. So when they start, when they are like 2-3 years old and you give them something to write, they make like big circles or long lines, but they don't circle to make it smaller. And then you start with papel A3, right? Very big paper. And then you go into A4. And then in A4, they have to make their circles a little smaller. And then you go giving them exercises to make them smaller, 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 until they get closer to the size of a letter. And then they are ready to write. Year 1 kids complain to you that their hand is hurting. Because of it hurts. Yes, it hurts. Because the brain is born ready to speak but not to write. Writing is an invention. It's a social convention. And then we have to learn it. So the body is ready to walk but not to run professionally as an athlete. To be an athlete, you have to learn how to. And this is training, as we need training to write. Because of all those things, it's useless to think of applying such an exam, such an assessment test for very, very, very young learners. But the families are going to ask you, but why starting when they are 8? They can barely read and write. Yeah, and it's their first measure of how much they can read and write in English. And then you go keeping their histórico de crescimento, you know, so you go registering year by year or every other year how much they have grown in terms of linguistic development. Well, nothing to say, right? The document is that and we have to follow when we are thinking of education and when we are thinking of bilingual education. Ah, mas não tem inglês de 1º a 5º ano nem na educação infantil. Ainda bem que não tem. Because then you look at what they are supposed to learn in history, geography, science, and math, and you come up with a very interesting bilingual integrated curriculum. And that's why tests now, the assessments now, they should be testing science repertoire, math repertoire, linguistic repertoire, and social studies repertoire. So the thing of just using English for social language, even though social language is very important, but that's not enough when we think of what is expected from us as educators. Not because BNCC exists, but we are talking about regular education. And if we think of BNCC as a problem, we have another one, right? We have the national document that is still waiting to be approved, not approved, homologado, right, to be published or whatever. But anyway, São Paulo has already made their state document, which is Resolução 190/2020, and it's valid. Santa Catarina already has the second one, right? And then the North and Northeast, almost all the states have one. And then Minas Gerais also has one. And in this document, we have very important things to take into consideration. And this is based on CFR. So what we know is that by year 6, the student should be A2. This is what the national expectation says. By the end of year 9, they should be B1, and by the end of senior high, they should be B2. The thing is, if they go into year 6, A2, borderline A1, they are not going to be, to year 9, B1 solid. They are going to be B1 borderline A2, or maybe most of them are still going to be A2. And then you are below the national expected results. So when you think of your curriculum now, think of, have a look at the new CFR. Because the new CFR has very clear descriptors of what you can teach. For example, here in below A1, they have information, for example, about measure. And they say that one of the things that the kids have to, that the students, not the kids, because it was not written for kids, right? We've been adapting it, but it's not written for kids. But they should understand that, for example, measures are different culturally. You don't buy things in kilos all over the world. You don't measure things in distance in kilometers all over the world, right? You don't buy things by liter all over the world. So this is a very specific skill, a descriptor that is there in pre-A1. I mean A1. A1 in a chapter called Plurilingual and Pluricultural Education. This chapter didn't exist in the former CFR. There is another one about sign language, one chapter about sign language and how sign language can help you when you don't know a word, for example. in English or in any other language. Sign language is a language, and gestures can really help you understand and communicate. So we already have goals to reach. So when we think of applying an assessment test here from the very beginning, when your year 3 students are still A1, you know where in A1 they are. You know how far they are from A2. And then it's easier for you to build and to organize the sequence of what you're going to do in order to reach the goals. Those goals that are not defined by your school, they are national. And even though we are not there, we must get there. We must get as close as possible, right? And then going back to our questions of what, where, when, and why, when we evaluate in our daily teaching, in our everyday life in the school, we should be applying our own diagnostic evaluations. We should use them again as formative, and then we should use the external assessment. Diagnostic tests, when you think of all the active approaches, when you think of visible learning techniques, they all imply starting from what the students know. They should tell you what they know. And then you work on the content and you go back to what do you know now? And you have them see what they knew and what they know, what they have learned, like in 1, 2, 3 weeks. And then you start developing self-evaluation skills, which is also very important, having the kids become responsible for the knowledge that they want to acquire and for the knowledge that they have. So the idea of using, like if you plan, I'm not talking about tests, I'm talking about activities. But if I'm gonna work, for example, with living things, and I have my kids make a list of all the living things that they know and they can name in English. And I just collect all those papers and I put them aside, and then we work with living things. Do what you have to do. And by the end, you ask them, make a list of the living things that you know today. And then you give them back the first list that they made and have them count how many words they had on their list in the beginning, and have them count how many they have at the end of the process. And then have them go back to what they knew about those living things in the beginning and all the things they learned through the process. This is working with diagnostic and formative assessment. And then when you go into external assessments, when you bring a Toefl assessment to your school, they are ready for that because they can see in their daily lives how much they have grown, how much they have learned. And then I finish this presentation so that we can go into questions and conversation by bringing an idea by Ofelia Garcia when she talks about L1 and L2, language 1, language 2. When we talk about what we know and what we want to know. And she says that this line is just like the sand and the ocean. You don't know where the sand finishes, you don't know where the ocean starts. So this is important for us to remember when we talk about measuring, trying to measure what people know. You'll never know exactly how much you could get from the student and how much the student really knows about everything. When you apply an assessment like Toefl, you are applying an assessment only in English. They don't know everything in English. They know much more than what they show in the test because the test is monolingual. So what do? You observe the results that they got in the Toefl assessment. You analyze, as Bruna mentioned, as I mentioned, and then you compare to the internal results in the other areas of knowledge. You talk to the students about how much they know, what they know and they learned in English, what they know and they learned in Portuguese, because they are much more than two languages. And this is what we should be assessing in our daily lives. So I think that this metaphor that Ofelia Garcia uses to talk about, you don't know where L1 ends and where L2 begins. This is very important for us as language teachers and teachers through the languages that we teach, as teachers who belong to a team in the schools, and especially when you work with regular schools. Being a team and working together with those teachers who teach in Portuguese is essential for the result, because you discover things that you wouldn't discover on your own. There are many papers, international papers, that are important research saying that, for example, students who are in the who are diagnosed, André, como é que fala? Diagnosticado com síndrome de Down ou no complexo autista, qualquer lugar do complexo autista, they are much happier and they learn much more in L2 than in L1. So the teacher who teaches in L2 can do much more for those kids than those who teach in L1. And the reason that science believes is that in L2, you don't show your emotions as much as you show in L1. And then L2 is a protection for those kids. And then they feel much more natural. They belong to the place and to the team, and they behave in a much better way for learning. They are more open to learn, and they learn more. I don't know if you have observed some of those kids in your schools. It's hard to work with them, but they know much more English, and they know much more in English than they know in Portuguese. Yeah? You have situations like that in your school? Yeah, this hasn't been studied very much in Brazil. There are very few people starting to study inclusão na educação bilíngue here in Brazil, but there are many international studies. The same thing goes with síndrome de Down, altas habilidades, and many things. They feel that they belong much better when the lesson is held in the second language of instruction than in the first. And this is important for us because in a test, for example, if you have a kid no espectro autista and the kid is going to take this test, this kid needs a lot of talk before the test, because they don't sit down and be quiet for so long. So we have to prepare to apply those assessments for those kids. They need they need absolute silence, which is one thing that we provide when we apply this kind of test, but they hate pressure. So the thing of faltam 20 minutos is the worst thing you can do. It's the worst thing you can do. Better if time is over and you get close to the kid and say, how far have you got? Wow, that's enough. Can you give it to me? Because if you try to pressure, they panic. And then you're going to have a disaster because they throw things. They will rasga a prova, joga em você. And you know how hard it is. So the idea is we have to pay attention to all those details when we apply a test in a regular school, because we have very special conditions for some kids in the school. They have the right of taking the test. They can be much better than some other kids. They can get wonderful results, but careful with the pressure. Make it é só mais uma prova. You know, é só mais uma prova. Don't overestimate it, because they are going to panic and destroy the moment for everyone. So those are some of the things that I would mention. Questions? Vocês querem ir embora? O que foi? No questions? No? Yes.
Speaking of kids who need special conditions for testing,
I don't know. Yes.
Yes, totally. You have registered. You need special conditions.
Eu nem sabia se oferecia, viu? Só estou falando que tem que ter.
Magnification, screen magnification, colors, many other special.
Carla? Oh, thank you. Mas, more questions? More questions? Eu tenho acompanhado 2 crianças no espectro autista. Um diagnóstico é Asperger e o outro não tem identificação no espectro ainda. E são crianças hoje de Year 4. Os resultados delas nas provas são muito superiores. Mas a gente tem usado uma estratégia na escola de chamá-las, explicar como é a prova e pedir que elas ensinem os outros. E eles amam fazer isso. Então, a gente dá instrução sobre os modelos de prova, o tipo de exercício, né, o tempo que dura, quantas perguntas tem, tudo para as crianças. E aí eles são da test helpers e eles dão as instruções. Com isso, eles internalizam melhor as instruções, eles se acalmam, porque todo mundo faz pergunta, mas eles têm todas as respostas. E o resultado no dia da aplicação é tranquilo, super tranquilo. E aí tem estratégias, né, que você coloca essas crianças sempre em uma das laterais da sala, porque se você puser no meio, ela tem os 2 campos de dispersão abertos, então coloca em uma lateral, porque você fecha 50% do campo de visão. Já não tem nada na parede mesmo, não tirou tudo para aplicar a prova? Então a parede é parede lisa, não tem desenhinho, não tem folhinha, não tem nada colado. Então coloca sempre numa lateral, de preferência na cadeira da frente e na lateral da sala, porque eu só vejo a bagunça desse lado. É metade do problema resolvido. Então, são coisas pequenas e que dão uma diferença enorme. Tragam essas crianças, elas são muitas na educação regular, muitas, cada vez mais. Cada vez mais com diagnósticos, às vezes, que a gente nunca ouviu falar. Então, entenda o diagnóstico, veja quais são as estratégias e traga essas crianças. Eu não costumo tirar as crianças da sala de prova, só se a prova for diferente. Se não, é na sala de prova, mas com um papel diferente. Então, eles sabem antes, eles ajudam a conferir se tem lápis em todas as cadeiras, eles ajudam a ver se tem uma borrachinha em todas as cadeiras, mas a gente inclui a criança no processo de preparo para o exame. Quando você aplica a prova, eles já estão sabendo o que é, eles fazem numa boa. Mas isso é muito importante, trazer as crianças para um preparo diferente antes da prova. Porque eles sentam, fazem, eles gostam de silêncio. Eles não gostam de barulhada, a prova é um ambiente silencioso. Só não dá para ficar, gente, meia hora, 15 minutos. Então, coloca no cronômetro, mas não fala. Não fala. No máximo, você... Se você tem essa situação de inclusão na sala, o que a gente tem feito é, põe no cronômetro... E aí o cronômetro já está mostrando quanto tempo falta. Aí aqueles que você sabe que são mais lentos, você vai passando e mostrando o cronômetro. Passa e mostra o cronômetro. Mas a gente não fala quanto tempo falta para não desconcentrar essas crianças. Senão você quer ajudar um e você atrapalha o outro. A gente tem como regra dar o tempo que falta, mas faça de outro jeito. Passa pela sala, vai mostrando para as outras crianças, aquela você passa, dá uma olhadinha na prova e vai, segue a vida, porque se você interromper por conta da pressão do tempo, eles desestabilizam completamente na sua aula. Então isso é importante.
Eu acho que é interessantíssimo isso, que a conotation...
Pega aqui, ó.
Onde está o outro?
Tá com a Carla, tá lá atrás.
É importante nos informar antes. Já tivemos casos que a escola fala assim, o exame amanhã está ligado.
Liga.
O exame está ligado. O exame amanhã, por exemplo, a propósito, eu tenho uma pessoa que precisa de special accommodation, não dá tempo de fazer uma coisa assim. Então, eles pede que avise antes. Normalmente, a ITS pede um laudo dos pais, do médico, para saber exatamente o que a gente precisa fazer. Então, com bastante antecedência, é o melhor possível. A gente já prepara, como a gente está falando, já está preparando a criança para isso. Já tivemos casos em que só de uma determinada professora ficar do lado de uma criança autista,
Resolve.
e ela não prestar atenção em mais nada, só nas instruções dessa professora, foi muito bem. E nós já tivemos casos de crianças disléxicas que tiveram um desempenho muito bom comparado com o resto da classe, simplesmente porque você respeita. E eu só queria acrescentar nesse negócio que é uma das coisas que a gente força com as escolas, a gente alerta. Não faça desse exame, ou de qualquer exame, mas desse exame especificamente, uma tortura. Não sei se vocês se lembram, agora todo mundo sente uma fila, não pode ir lá do lado. Então, se a gente fala aquele negócio com medo danado, né? A gente fala, é mais um dia de escola, só ter um pouco mais de silêncio, vocês fazem um exame, e é como, o melhor exemplo que a gente tem dado é esse, é como o pediatra faz com a criança. O bebê vai lá, ele mede a altura, né, e o peso. Se o cara tiver um pai alto, é normal que ele seja maior do que os pais menores, né? Então, é a evolução normal da criança. E eu acho que isso é muito importante que as escolas respeitem a evolução da criança naquela matéria.
Tem uma coisa, enquanto você leva para o Lúcio, que é importante, Eugênio. A gente, dentro da escola regular, a gente adoraria ter os laudos. A metade das nossas crianças de inclusão não tem laudo, não é não, gente? Porque a mãe não quer saber o laudo. Então, muitos casos, a gente sabe que a criança tem alguma coisa que parece, mas nós não vamos diagnosticar, e a família, você chama a família, você pede, a família escorrega por aqui, por ali, por lá, e não leva, e laudo é coisa de neurologista, é muito sério. Então, para essas crianças que não têm laudo, e que a carta da família não vai vir nunca, porque nem o laudo da família quer ter, a gente, como professor, precisa ter esses cuidados com essas crianças, independente do laudo. O laudo é um papel. E a gente entende que para algumas famílias é muito difícil ouvir que o seu filho tem este rótulo, porque é um rótulo. Infelizmente, é visto como rótulo. E é difícil para a família aceitar, seu filho tem essa situação e o tratamento é esse, o comportamento é esse. Às vezes não é tratamento, é comportamento que você tem que entender e lidar com ele. Uma dessas crianças que eu mencionei, eu fiz uma saída pedagógica com a turma, a escola desse menino, ano passado, e nós fomos para aquele sítio Carroção, não sei, todo mundo conhece o sítio Carroção. Enfim, estávamos lá e uma atividade era, o guia falou, senta todo mundo que eu vou contar a história do universo. Todo mundo sentou. E esse menino andando. Aí eu chamei, falei, senta que ele vai falar do assunto que você mais gosta, porque esse menino é alucinado por planetas, todos eles têm, né? Um tema. Ele falou assim para mim, eu estou ouvindo com as minhas orelhas. Por que que eu tenho que sentar? Você entende? Estou ouvindo com as minhas orelhas. Então, isso é uma criança autista. Por que que tem que sentar? O outro chegou um dia e disse, quanto eu preciso em matemática? A professora falou, você precisa de 4. Quantas questões ele respondeu? Por que que eu vou fazer 10? Eu preciso de 4. Isso é uma criança no espectro autista. Inteligentíssimos. Mas se você não acolher nesse exame, ele... professor, essa prova é muito comprida. Professor, eu não entendi. Então, tem que acolher antes. Trazer para você, contar como é a prova, pedir ajuda. Me ajuda a explicar. Porque aí você tem um resultado diferente no dia da prova. Desculpa, Lúcio, se deixar eu falo até amanhã.
Eu tenho uma dúvida que você colocou no início, de que você falou sobre a preparação do teste, do curso para as crianças. Você usualmente não faz.
Não, eu não faço.
No nosso caso, eu queria discutir esse assunto, porque ele é polêmico, né? de ter o que a gente chama do preparatório,
Do prep.
nós nosso teste tem alguns diferenciais em relação à maioria das provas que os alunos estão acostumados. Tem os adultos. Né?
Sim.
Quem nunca fez um TOEFL, quem nunca fez um Toefl, aos 80 anos, aos 60, aos 30, vai sentir o impacto da prova, vai controlar mal o tempo, não vai saber conduzir o processo. Sobre a nossa ótica, se não tiver uma preparação para o teste, a gente não vai conseguir medir o idioma, porque ele vai perder o tempo, não vai administrar o tempo, vai mal o resultado eventual, não por falta de conhecimento, e sim porque não soube trabalhar adequadamente. Então, eu queria que você esclarecesse um pouco melhor, porque meu amigo André, inclusive, aqui é meu parceiro na formulação dos cursos não falo, mas
Preparatórios.
a preparação dos alunos para, aí sim, fazer o teste. Inclusive as escolas, nossos clientes têm pedido isso, né? Não é obrigatório, mas quando o cliente quer conhecer o Toefl Júnior, o processo inicial se dá através desse simulado que a gente criou.
Tá, então vamos lá. Eu acho que depende muito do objetivo que a escola tem e do resultado que ela quer alcançar. Quando a gente fala de um adulto que vai fazer um teste desse, tem muito mais experiência de vida, sabe muito mais coisas e não tem controle do tempo, entra em pânico por causa do tipo de exercício. Esse adulto, geralmente, está fora do banquinho da escola faz tempo. Criança em idade escolar não faz nada na vida além de tarefa, projeto, prova. Para eles é só mais uma. O que desespera na prova, nas avaliações Toefl, como em qualquer outra que tenha a mesma finalidade, não importa. Todas elas são grandes e o Toefl não é para terminar. Ninguém está esperando que o menino termine a provinha inteira lá no 3º ano. E a gente tem que deixar isso claro para ele, que ele não vai terminar. Eu acho que se a escola gosta do preparatório, claro que ela vai ter um resultado superior das minhas. Se ela der um preparatório, o resultado tende a ser superior do que as minhas escolas. Mas para mim, sem preparatório, o que eu quero é isso. O que você faz sem estudar? Porque o inglês que eu falo hoje, eu não estudei para falar. Então, com as coisas boas e ruins que ele tem, que eu não estou nem aí, né? Eu sei que não é perfeito, que não será, e está tudo bem para mim. Mas o que eu penso é essa ideia, que eu posso ter um preparatório e um resultado, e vamos lá, a gente tem uma cobrança de resultado que eu coloquei aqui. É Ministério da Educação dizendo que é para dar resultado. Então, preparar para as provas tranquiliza em relação a resultado. O que a gente não pode fazer é do preparo uma tensão em relação à prova.
Eu vou acrescentar, todas as escolas querem um bom resultado.
Sim.
Para justamente ter a tranquilidade de que o processo de treinamento está adequado. Se não se faz o preparatório, esse resultado não vai ser tão bom quanto deveria. Então, de novo, eu acho que eu entendo o seu ponto de vista, mas sob a ótica das escolas, que já tem um pouco de receio com relação ao resultado do Toefl, né, eu garanto que se tiver o simulado, eu vou chamar de simulado,
tranquiliza.
Vai ser um curso preparatório, mas o simulado ajuda, né, a escola a conseguir um bom resultado, se, obviamente, o treinamento estiver...
Com certeza. Resultado maior, não discuto, é maior. Se preparar para a prova, o resultado é maior. Agora, não tem certo, não tem errado, tem escolhas e tem perfil de escola. Tem perfil de escola, tem perfil de professor, porque às vezes a gente diz, não prepara, não precisa preparar, você entra na aula, o que o infeliz está fazendo? Ele está preparando, porque ele acredita que tem que preparar. Então, vai de escola para escola, de profissional para profissional e de resultado esperado dentro do prazo, né? É que também, Lúcio, hoje as escolas que eu trabalho têm, no mínimo, 5 aulas semanais, 8 aulas semanais, 14 aulas semanais. Se não der resultado, me mata, né? Porque
o programa bilíngue, ele depende de ter, é content-based.
é content-based. Então,
a escola também quer language,
Aham.
e sai.
Então,
Eu tô fazendo language só nas minhas 5 aulas de language por semana. Tô fazendo language em math.
isso.
Então eu tô preparando as crianças na daily basis.
Daily based.
Todo dia.
É isso.
Mas na escola, a gente vai pela primeira vez testar. Não é o Toefl, é um outro tipo, mas é a primeira vez que a gente vai usar. A gente colocou standards and benchmarks. Então, o que eu espero para um year 2?
Isso. Isso.
Um year 4. E isso está dentro do meu currículo, independente da prova que eles vão fazer agora em novembro.
Exato.
Dentro do meu currículo, students talk about preferences. Students can...
Isso. Agora, sabe uma coisa que é interessante no processo de escolha? Toefl não é só a única escolha. Não é. Mas vamos lá. Quando eu penso em exames Cambridge, eu penso em exames de resultado e não de processo. É resultado. Você fez starters, passou. Movers, passou. Toefl você não passa e nem é retido. Você vai num caminho de crescimento. Quando a gente pensa em exames Cambridge, a gente está falando em teoria clássica de teste, número de acerto, nota. Quando a gente fala em Toefl, a gente fala em teoria de resposta ao item, que é a metodologia do Enem, que é a metodologia do SAEB inteiro. Toda a prova SAEB é TRI. Então, o que a gente precisa olhar também? Como eu quero esse resultado de avaliação? Eu quero uma avaliação de teoria clássica de teste, soma dos acertos é a minha nota, ou eu quero uma avaliação que tem outras complexidades que eu, como uma boa pessoa formada em letras e pedagogia, não sei explicar. Mas eu sei que você tem um cálculo estatístico de acerta, erra, voltou a acertar. Quando o número de erros for maior que o acerto, a prova parou ali. Porque dali para frente você chutou. Então, isso é importante para a gente quando faz a escolha do instrumento de avaliação. Como é que a gente vê o processo de avaliação dentro da escola? Como está o processo de avaliação no mundo? Vamos pensar em PISA. PISA é TRI. O MEC, com todos os tsunamis que passam por lá, pelo menos o processo de avaliação já é um processo TRI para tudo, para SARESP, para todas as provas que estão dentro do SAEB. Então, vale a pena a gente analisar esses processos para fazer a escolha do instrumento de avaliação. É fundamental ter um, mas é importante saber o que está por trás da elaboração de prova que a gente vai aplicar, porque a gente dê o nome que der, ela tem cara de prova. Então é importante entender esses pressupostos para fazer a escolha do que combina mais com a identidade de cada instituição, né? Ligou? Liga. Então fala que nem professora, que não precisa. Fala que nem professora, Thaís, ou pega o meu.
Eu acho que eu prefiro, em vez de simulado, em vez de preparatório, eu prefiro dar a familiarização.
Também. Também.
Tem que fazer, não é preparar, mas familiarizar contigo. É assim. Por isso que a EDF vai ser.
Eu acho que mostrar como vai ser, é bem legal. A gente não pode ter mãe botando criança para estudar, né?
E também uma coisa muito importante, né?
Pega aqui, vem cá.
Eles falam, não precisa, obrigado.
Professor também.
Fail or pass.
Sim.
Isso é usado dentro dos processos de avaliação na ETS. There is no fail or pass.
Isso.
Okay? É um processo crescente mesmo, não é para passar.
Isso que é importante, não é? A gente ter um processo que mostra os pequenos avanços, porque todo pequeno avanço é motivo de celebração. Então, isso é muito mais importante do que passei na prova X. Eles vão passar na prova a vida inteira, vão ter que passar num monte de prova. Então, vivenciar um processo que vai te mostrando os seus pequenos progressos É um processo diferente e é um processo muito interessante. É um processo que o vestibular não vai fazer. O vestibular passou ou não passou, amigo, um abraço, presta o ano que vem. Né? Conteudista. O que a gente está falando aqui não é de um processo conteudista, é de um processo que usa conteúdos por meio da língua para acessar um repertório que é muito maior que o linguístico, que é um repertório ali, claro, que de várias áreas do conhecimento, contempladas por diversos recursos de língua, mas eu preciso ter estabilidade para sentar, olhar para essa prova e resolver a prova, até onde eu chegar. E é isso que importa. Exato. Isso, e isso é importante. Sim. Exatamente. Exatamente. Então, acho que é esse caminho, né? Por favor.
Sou Alexandre. Muito legal participar com vocês aqui. Eu tenho uma escola de idiomas, não é ensino regular. E queria compartilhar com vocês um desafio que apareceu essa semana. Conheci uma mãe que tem um filho autista e ela estava falando do desafio de matricular o filho dela numa escola de ensino regular, uma escola de 3.000 alunos, onde o dono da escola estava com medo de ter o filho dela como aluno, porque tinha que ter um AT, né, um acompanhante. Então ela tinha medo de vínculo trabalhista, eu não conhecia da situação. E ela me contou o calvário que ela passou até conseguir matricular o filho dela.
Nessa escola?
Nessa escola, e conseguiu.
Não devia. Uma escola que não quer ter o filho, não é escola para ter o filho.
Aí o que eu achei interessante, eu falei, poxa, eu vou usar isso como desafio. E aí conversando com ela, meu filho fala inglês, né? Eu falei, interessante, aí traz o menino, né? Quando eu conheci o filho dela, realmente o menino começou a desempenhar o idioma e eu falei, poxa, eu vou pegar isso como desafio, né? Porque não é uma coisa normal de você se ver numa escola de idiomas, né? Principalmente ensino regular, sim, mas não é conteúdo. E tivemos, eu estou com as professoras, né? Eu sempre jogo elas na batata quente na mão dela. E fizeram uma aula experimental com esse aluno, acompanhante. Foi extraordinária a aula. A mãe se sentiu super valorizada. E eu falei com ela se ela topava vir comigo nessa caminhada, me ensinar, né, a ter a inclusão social, a inclusão na educação de pessoas com essas necessidades especiais. Né? Eu comecei com idiomas, o inglês, e por necessidade de querer inclusão, porque o slogan da minha escola é Soluções Educacionais, Oxford English Press, então eu acho muito importante essa inclusão. Começamos com Libras, depois, e agora estamos trazendo essas pessoas com necessidades especiais. Contratamos uma psicopedagoga também, porque tem que ter um acompanhamento. E está sendo um desafio muito interessante, muito gostoso. Espero colher bons frutos logo no futuro.
Eu tenho uma escola em Cuiabá. Eles têm uma professora que se comunica por língua americana de sinais. E tudo que ela faz com as crianças, ela fala inglês e ela fala por
Em qualquer lugar de corredor, esse professor já começa a falar em Libras, é muito interessante.
É muito bom.
A educação é muito rápida.
É sim. E como os institutos de línguas, eles têm aulas mais curtas, é mais fácil vencer os desafios das crianças no espectro autista. A escola regular, ela é mais desafiadora porque a criança fica muito tempo. Então, para a gente, o tempo muito grande, ele é um grande desafio. A escola de língua, como eles ficam por um período menor, nos cursos em geral, né? Claro que há exceções. Então, é mais fácil acolher e fazer um excelente trabalho com essas crianças. E fala inglês, não é? Fala inglês o menino. Fala, você não sabe nem de onde veio o inglês que fala, mas fala. É assim mesmo. E? Chega, that's it? Chega, that's it, senão eu vou, né? Forever and ever aqui.
Eu acho
chamar
Carla?
sorteio.